Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving headfirst into a massive medical mystery that completely reshaped human history. You know, we really take modern medicine for granted, don't we? But getting to where we are today required shattering some seriously ancient, deeply held beliefs. So let's explore this incredible journey of how humanity finally discovered the invisible world all around us, and more importantly, how we learn to fight back.
Picture this. You're walking down a street in the 19th century. Up until the mid-1800s, people honestly didn't know why diseases happened. If you asked a doctor back then, they'd probably tell you that sickness was caused by miasma, which literally translates to bad air. People firmly believed that the terrible, putrid smells rising from dirty city alleys, open sewers, and rotting food were the actual creators of disease. And, to be totally fair to them, it wasn't a completely illogical leap. Filthy environments absolutely do spread infections, but they thought the bad smell itself was the killer. Because we couldn't actually see the tiny life forms thriving in all that filth, humanity was basically fighting an enemy completely blind.
So, let's contrast these two ideas. For centuries, cities tried to prevent disease just by masking bad odors and trying to clear away this terrifying invisible cloud of miasma. But the hidden truth? It was something else entirely. Microorganisms. The real killer wasn't the smell at all. It was the microscopic creatures living inside the filth. And transitioning to this new reality, that did not happen overnight. It took a shockingly long time for society to accept that something literally too small to see could actually kill you.
Section 1. Discovery of the Invisible World.
Get this. The very first detective to peek behind the curtain of this hidden universe wasn't a doctor or some fancy university professor. Nope, he was a Dutch cloth merchant from Delft named Antonie van Leeuwenhoek. He just happened to have a really specific, almost obsessive hobby, grinding and polishing tiny lenses. Now, back in the 17th century, microscopes were incredibly basic, but Leeuwenhoek managed to craft lenses with astonishingly high magnification for the time. One day, he decides to look at a drop of pond water through his handmade lens, and he is absolutely stunned. He sees countless tiny life forms just darting around in the water. He called them animalcules, which is just a fantastic word for what we now call microorganisms. He documented the whole thing and sent his findings to the Royal Society of London in 1677, essentially giving us the very first scientific record of this hidden world. But here is a wild piece of history. Even with Leeuwenhoek's big discovery in 1677, the medical world didn't instantly change. Not at all. People knew these little animalcules existed, sure, but the idea that they could actually make a human being sick or cause a plague, that was just way too bizarre for society to swallow. It actually took a massive 200-year gap before brilliant scientific minds in the late 1800s finally connected the dots between these tiny creatures and human disease.
Section 2. Germ theory and the crucial experiment. All right, so by the late 19th century, microscopes had gotten a lot better, and a French chemist named Louis Pasteur enters the chat. Fascinatingly, Pasteur didn't even start off studying human disease. He was actually trying to solve a major economic crisis in France. Why were their wine and beer spoiling? Peering through his microscope, he realized that fermentation and spoilage weren't just things that magically happened. Specific microbes were doing the fermenting, and completely different microbes were causing the spoilage. Now, at the time, people still believed in spontaneous generation, basically the idea that life, like maggots on meat or mold on bread, just poofed into existence out of non-living matter. Pasteur knew he had to destroy this ancient myth once and for all. So he designed the now famous swan-neck flask experiment. And yes, by the way, this is the exact same Pasteur whose name is on the pasteurized milk sitting in your fridge right now. The genius of this experiment is just how simple it is. First, Pasteur took meat broth and boiled it inside a flask to kill off any existing microbes. Then comes the brilliant part. The flask had this long, curved, S-shaped neck. Air could flow in and out freely, but any floating dust or microbes would get stuck in the curve and couldn't actually reach the liquid. Because of this, the liquid stayed completely clear and sterile for a long, long time. But the very second he broke that neck off or tilted the flask so the broth touched the trapped dust, boom, the microbes rushed in, multiplied, and the liquid rapidly spoiled.
So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Pasteur proved without a shadow of a doubt that life has to come from existing life. Microbes come from the outside environment. They don't just spontaneously generate. And that led him to ask a question that literally altered history. If invisible microbes from the air can spoil our food, could they also be the invisible force making us sick?
And just like that, germ theory is born. But we've got to give credit to another absolute giant in this field. While Pasteur opened the door and suggested that microbes cause disease, it was a German scientist named Robert Koch who laid down the rigorous, ironclad scientific rules to prove exactly which germ caused which disease. Koch's meticulous work directly linked specific bacteria to major killers like anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Because of the 1-2 punch of Pasteur and Koch, the entire medical world completely shifted its language. We finally stopped blaming bad air and started targeting pathogens. This was the literal dawn of sterilized operating rooms, clean food, and modern public health.
Section 3. Vaccines become a science. Okay, so now we know what the enemy is. The next big question is, how on earth do we fight it? Pasteur asked a pretty profound question. Could we actually use these same microbes to prevent the very diseases they cause? Now, decades earlier, Edward Jenner had shown that getting cowpox could somehow prevent smallpox, but that was based purely on observation. Nobody back then had a clue about viruses or immune cells. Pasteur wanted to take that idea and turn it into an exact science. And his big aha moment? It happened totally by accident. He was studying chicken cholera, and he accidentally injected his lab birds with an old, forgotten batch of bacteria that had just been sitting out. The chickens got a little bit sick, but they survived. Later on, he injected those exact same chickens with a fresh, highly lethal batch of bacteria. Miraculously, they didn't get sick at all. Pasteur realized a phenomenal truth. Weakened microbes can actually build up defense capabilities in the body without causing the disease itself.
And that realization gave birth to the concept of the attenuated vaccine. Basically, Pasteur figured out how to intentionally weaken a pathogen. It's exactly like the vaccines we rely on today. By introducing this weakened version into your body, it doesn't make you severely ill, but it perfectly trains your immune system to remember what the threat looks like. Today, we call this active immunity and immunological memory. But back then, this was practically magic. Pasteur took Jenner's old observations and transformed vaccinology into a precise, calculated science.
To prove to the world that this wasn't just some lab fluke, Pasteur staged a massive, highly dramatic public spectacle in 1881 at Pouilly-le-Fort in France. At the time, anthrax was absolutely ravaging livestock and destroying the agricultural economy. So Pasteur vaccinated half a flock of sheep with his brand new attenuated anthrax vaccine and left the other half completely unvaccinated. Then, with a crowd of scientists, journalists, and politicians watching, he injected every single sheep with a deadly dose of anthrax. The results were stunning. Every single unvaccinated sheep died, while every vaccinated sheep lived. European society was utterly blown away. Vaccine science had officially arrived on the world stage.
Section 4. The miracle rabies treat ants. Now, saving farm animals is one thing, and it was a huge economic win, but it immediately raised a terrifying new question. Could we use these weakened microbes to save human lives? To really understand the immense pressure of this moment, you have to grasp the sheer dread associated with rabies in the 19th century. If you're bitten by a rabid dog back then, it was essentially a death sentence. The fatality rate was virtually 100%. People were absolutely, understandably terrified of it. It meant a slow, agonizing death that involved convulsions and an intense, horrific fear of water. Pasteur had been diligently experimenting with the rabies virus, which is crazy because he couldn't even see it since viruses are way smaller than bacteria. But he figured out he could weaken the rabies pathogen by drying out the infected nerve tissue of animals. Then, in 1885, push came to shove. A desperate mother arrived at Pasteur's laboratory, carrying her 9-year-old son, Joseph Meister. The boy had been brutally bitten by a rabid dog. Without some kind of intervention, he was almost certainly going to die. But Pasteur faced an agonizing dilemma. Remember, he was a chemist, not a medical doctor. If he injected this young boy with a highly experimental treatment and the boy died, Pasteur could be prosecuted for murder and his entire legacy ruined. But doing nothing meant certain death for the child. Pasteur took the monumental risk. He injected Joseph with his experimental, weakened rabies vaccine over the course of several days. And then, they waited. Days passed, then weeks. The boy never developed symptoms. He survived. Because the vaccine trained his body to fight off the virus before it could actually travel to his brain.
When the news broke that Pasteur had snatched a child back from a virtually 100% fatal disease, it sent absolute shockwaves across the globe. The Pasteur Institute was founded shortly after, becoming the epicenter for global infectious disease research.
Section 5, Great Legacy Without a Nobel.
Pasteur's discoveries essentially birthed the modern field of immunology, and it triggered a wave of brilliant scientists who took his foundation and just ran with it. Look at this roster. Robert Koch won a Nobel for his bacteriology work. Ilya Mechnikov, who actually worked at the Pasteur Institute, famously watched starfish larvae under a microscope and saw cells eating foreign objects, literally discovering cellular immunity. He won a Nobel. Emil von Behring won for his diphtheria treatment. Paul Ehrlich won for developing the concept of antibodies. All of these giants received the ultimate scientific accolade, the Nobel Prize, and they all built their award-winning discoveries squarely upon the bridge that Louis Pasteur had constructed.
So that begs the question, why on earth is Pasteur's name missing from the list of Nobel laureates? Well, it's a really surprising and honestly kind of ironic bit of historical trivia. It has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of his science. Louis Pasteur died in 1895. The Nobel Prize didn't even exist until 1901. And with extremely rare exceptions, the Nobel Committee has a very strict rule. The prize is not awarded posthumously. So the man who fundamentally changed how we understand human disease, the man who laid the very foundation for immunology, simply died 6 years too early to get the award. He stands distinctly as the greatest figure from the era just before the Nobel Prize existed.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Does true greatness actually require a medal? I mean, the Nobel Prize is incredible, sure, but Pasteur's true legacy is the countless millions of human beings who are alive today because of his work. He dared to look into the invisible world and fight the monsters he found hiding in there. But it really makes you wonder, with millions of undiscovered microbes still out there today, what invisible revolutions are we currently completely blind to? Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you in the next explainer.